record. Okay, share screen. So share screen. There we go. Share. I am now sharing my screen. Okay. Sorry about that, technical difficulties. Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Literature 2021, American Classics. This will be lecture 2, The Untold Greatness of the Hardy Boys. And you might have noticed I screwed up there a little bit and let the joke go too early because I pressed forward on the PowerPoint. This is, of course, Philosophy 2600, Ethics and Science. And this is going to be our second official lecture. We are having an overview of ethical systems. We're going to cover the ones in our textbook, with this lecture adding a little bit more color to the picture. I do hope that you are reading the textbook. My lectures are intended to build on the reading, not replace the reading. But before we get into those 3 ethical theories, let's talk about some of the problems with ethics. And I do air quotes on the word problems because I don't think they're problems in the sense of they destroy the idea of ethics. I believe in ethics. I want to be ethical. It's just more that these are things we need to consider. There's a very smart guy, philosopher named Wittgenstein, pronouncing his name wrong, who wrote once that it is clear that ethics cannot be expressed, and that's in the Tractatus. What he means there is that ethics are not a solved science. We can't offer a mathematical proof of it. I can't sit down and crunch the numbers and say, aha, I've solved the formula of ethics. That doesn't exist. That doesn't work. So where do we find the source of ethics? Do we find it in religion? If so, whose religion and which sect of that religion, which denomination? If we find it in nature, well, again, which nature? Are we only looking at vertebrates? Are we looking at mammals only? And wouldn't it be good if we could, as beings that might be a little bit more able to comprehend than, say, my TA Lou over here, who's a dog, and shouldn't I have a little bit better of a sense of ethics than he does? And then there's culture. Well, which culture? I think we'll see it when we look at an older form of ethics from a different culture that maybe everything doesn't apply. And another option would be reason, but I would still want to ask, well, whose reason? And is reason really the be-all, end-all? Does reason not just circle us back to the problem of ethics is not mathematics? All that to say that agreement is not universal. It's murky, it's messy, which is what makes it good for philosophy, and I think valid and relevant for life. The 3 ethical frameworks that we are looking at from our textbook are virtue ethics, deontological ethics, and consequential ethics. And each of these have their own strengths and weaknesses. There's a handy little figure chart on page 58 of our textbook. Look, I put the page number there. It's probably a quiz question. There are some other systems, though, and our textbook even acknowledges care ethics, which comes out of feminist philosophy, and I would say raises some really good questions and points. There's also the way that we could look at religious ethics and how they don't really fit into any of these 3 categories. Religious systems are fascinating and interesting that way. We need to be careful not to read our own prejudices or even our own present understanding into an ancient text. You could look at the Bible, for example, and probably read any 3 of these ethical frameworks into it, but it doesn't mean that the Bible is only virtue ethics. You could do the same thing with the Bhagavad Gita. What I'm trying to get at here is that nuance is necessary. So let's start with virtue ethics. The big figure here is, of course, Aristotle. Aristotle is one of the big 3 Greek philosophers. And let's talk about his ethics. He emphasized eudaimonia, which translates into English not perfectly well, but is somewhere between happiness, flourishing, and well-being. It's this thing in philosophy that we call the good life. And what he was aiming for is these golden means. If you've got like a needle chart between, you've got deficiencies on one side and excesses on the other, and he wants to sort of aim in the middle. And everybody's got their own individual bend, but you need to move that needle so that you're hitting the mean. Now, we need to talk about how Aristotle is in some ways elitist and ableist and pretty anthropocentric. Only the noble have the leisure time and the ability to cultivate virtue in Aristotle's system. Does this mean that virtue ethics needs to be rejected? Well, no, but we can recognize that Aristotle had quite a few flaws, and if we're going to do virtue ethics today, we would probably reject some of the virtues that he lists. And we would probably want to say that virtue can be practiced and developed by more than just noble men. Can virtue be practiced by animals? Well, maybe. Certainly you can train an animal. We have Lou over here. I've got a bunch of dog treats that I'm giving to him so that he doesn't do anything bad while we're recording. And am I developing virtue in him if I teach him to respect strangers? Maybe. Aristotle's virtues, as he lists them, are courage, temperance, generosity, magnificence, magnanimity, right ambition, anger, friendliness, truthfulness, and wit. I think most of us would look at that list and say, okay, there's a couple here that are a little strange. Magnificence and magnanimity are both a little bit too focused on wealth for most of us. How rich people spend their money to make themselves look good and earn honors in Greek society is pretty much what those two boil down to. And right there is the problem. Virtues are not necessarily universal unless we want to just keep most of the list but toss out a few. There are people who might want to debate anger as well. His explanation of anger is pretty good. Another word for there might be righteous indignation. It's an option. Continued on virtue, there are other thinkers like Thomas Aquinas that list different virtues or add other virtues based on their religious context or their cultural context. Some good things about virtue are that virtue is cultivated and practiced. There's this process of bending yourself into a virtuous form. All of that we can say is good. We just might want to try and separate it from its pretty elitist roots. And yeah, like we said, is it relative to culture? Absolutely. But how much of a problem does this pose? Does this change for us as cultures get to know each other a little bit better in a global society? Maybe. I don't know. I don't have an answer to that question. And where do cultural values come from? Do they come from history? And if the culture had been different somewhere else, it would have completely different values? Well, probably. But is there anything about these cultural values that are inherent to nature or are perhaps even divinely inspired? I don't have answers to these questions. It's something we might want to figure out for ourselves. And then again, these carefully laid out systems are a luxury of privilege. One thing that I like to study is liberation theology. And in liberation theology, you don't get these big lists of ethics like Aristotle makes. It's not that there aren't ethical principles in liberation theology. It's just the people writing it have more pressing concerns like the survival of their own cultures and the deaths of people they care about. And there's incredibly strong ethical principles there. But the systematized versions of it, not so much. That takes leisure. Then we have deontology, which is a very interesting form of ethics, as are all of them really. The major figure of deontology is Immanuel Kant, who is very difficult to read, and so I'm not going to quote him directly here. Anybody who's ever tried to read Kant, and I've read my own fair share, they'll know what I'm talking about. But the big deal here is that there are these moral obligations that we have regardless of the outcome. The question is, to whom are we obliged, and what are these obligations? Am I morally obliged to my own sense of integrity, to whatever might please me, to the well-being of my neighbor, to divinity? Am I obliged to systems of law within my country? If so, aren't there ways that you could appeal to higher laws, higher principles that transcend whatever those earthly laws are? Now, there's kind of a punk rock quality to deontology there, where it's, yeah, maybe the system is wrong. And isn't there something higher that I could appeal to? There might also be a chance to appeal to divine commands. A good way to look at deontological ethics is absolute pacifism. People would say, well, my religious system says, thou shalt not kill, and so I will not kill. I have Superman pictured here on the side because I think he is a nice picture of deontology. What stops the all powerful Superman from enslaving humanity and ending all violence on Earth so that he can have a more peaceful planet for the people he cares about? Well, his sense of ethics. Then we have consequentialism, and this is really the primary form of ethics we see in most sciences. Um, the big thing here is that good and bad are affected by the moral outcome, not the intention. Saying, well, I didn't mean to, doesn't work for consequentialism. It's what is the consequence of your action? What are we looking for here? We're looking for the greatest good for the greatest number of people. What is good is what produces the greatest good and the least harm. The least harm there is important. Um, and this is where we kind of get into some unfortunate math that is sometimes done with ethical systems like this. This is the trolley problem, where what if you could kill one person to save five? Is that ethical? Should we do that? Consequentialists might say yes, provided there are not further details on how killing that one person might cause more harm. And the two kind of big wings with plenty of degradations in between here are utilitarianism and hedonism. The utilitarian would say, well, what's right is what's right for the majority. And we might want to pause here and say, well, what about the minority? What did they do to be counted out of what is right? Then the other side is hedonism, people who seek pleasure and avoid suffering. You might make an appeal here to nature and say, well, what does my dog do? He seeks pleasure. The pleasure he wants is food and pets and security. And so the way he seeks that is by being a dog that people like to pet and keep secure. He's avoiding suffering there. But is that it? Is that the be all end all? That's a big question. It's with the hedonists. I would always wonder. It's really that's it. Your own pleasure. There's nothing higher. There's nothing greater. A consequentialist might ask, is it okay to lie if that lie saves a life? And they would say yes. The question we might ask here is, well, what are we defining as a good consequence and for who? Like we've talked about already here. What qualifies someone as a moral subject? Knowing that a really large number of people throughout history have not been considered moral subjects when they should have been. So, how far do we need to expand that boundary? And does that boundary end at human? Does it end at Homo sapiens, or do we consider animals, plant life, ecosystems to also be moral subjects? There are a lot of thinkers, especially in environmental philosophy, that would say, yes, you need to consider the biosphere or the biotic community, if you want to quote Aldo Leopold, as moral subjects, and therefore people we need to consider when considering what is good and for whom. And like I said at the beginning of this slide, in general, consequentialism is the norm for scientific ethics. It doesn't mean that we can't apply these other ones, and I think we should. And what I'm going to do in the next lecture is kind of go through some questions and try and apply the other systems to them to see how that might change our decision making. All right, going back to the slide we were on. All right, so some further thoughts. We could also consider care ethics, where the people behind care ethics would say agency is relational. I don't do ethics in a bubble, right? Ethics is a cooperative thing. It involves multiple moral agents, and in some way there's a negotiation that happens between you, right? Like I need to not offend my own moral sensibilities. I need to do right by myself ethically, but I also need to not cause harm to you. I need to make sure that I'm caring for you. I kind of think about it like maybe with EMTs, right? You when you get to the scene, you want to make sure the scene is safe. Then you can start to help someone. And care ethics also deals more in small scale and personal ethical questions, which is a very good thing because a lot of these massive ethical questions about how things should be governed or, how do we distribute a vaccine to 7 billion people are not the moral questions that we are going to deal with every day. They're not even the moral questions that the average scientist is going to be dealing with in terms of ethics. So to lower that scale is a very important thing in care ethics. And then there's this case by case basis for decision making, where we need to consider the ethical implications every time we're making a decision to avoid these universal declarations. There's also a really important point we need to make here that there is a big difference between real traumatic events and thought experiments. And in the next lecture, we're going to be looking at thought experiments, and I'm going to avoid anything that seems like a real traumatic event because in the moment, in the actual situation, there are lots of ethical considerations that are under the surface or above the surface that we as the observer don't have access to. And it's unfair of us to judge others based on our limited perception there. And then another question I think we probably need to ask is how does our positioning in the world change our perspective? Going back to our buddy Aristotle, where is he? Yeah, he's got a limited perspective. He's rich and powerful in his society, more so than those that came before him. And so it really tints his view of the world. He's looking Aristotle is looking through at the world through a different set of glasses than you and I are. And it changes his way of looking at ethics. And then another question to consider is can we really separate ethics into different systems? What do we gain by doing this, by you know dissecting ethical questions? What do we lose? I think there are gains and losses there, and I don't know, I wonder because yes, you can gain a further understanding by picking something apart, but isn't there also the chance that you'll do violence to it? And yeah, that runs a very real risk that a lot of folks have not done well in the past. So to proceed with caution. So what is next? What I want you to do before watching lecture 3 is to read that letter from Birmingham jail piece. It is the other reading you have. And then I want you to watch lecture 3. At the end of that one, I will give you more details on the discussion post for this week. I don't want to do it now because the next one comes next. What else should I talk about? This is the first lecture that I am recording since actually meeting all of you and reading your first discussion posts. I want to thank you for following along and for the good feedback I've been getting from you, and really just for being actual humans. The first two of these that I recorded, it kind of felt like I was screaming into the void about ethics while the world was falling apart on the news, like on a TV right there. And all of that's getting a little bit better. I hope that my ability to record videos is getting a little bit better. If it's not, please tell me what's wrong so I can fix it. I'm all about constructive feedback. Other than that, yeah, ethics is a really big subject. I think there's going to be a lot more clarity we add in the next lecture, looking at different scenarios where we can apply various forms of ethics. We kind of just ran roughshod over thousands of years of philosophy all at once just because of the format we're in. I'm hoping that discussion boards are helpful for this so that we can tease out a little bit more meaning. With that said, I'm going to get ready to record lecture 3, And I hope you all have a good day. I hope you are staying safe, and it has been excellent to get to know you.